Welcome back, Paul Catalina, Pierre Nugent, alongside Pierre, fresh out of doing his civic duty last week, and we're very proud of him for doing so.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
it's a pleasure to be back.
Even though he did try to get out of it, but...
I sure did. I mean, I think that kind of is part of the whole process too. Is if you can get yourself out of it as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's true. I mean, there's nothing more American than shirking what your responsibilities.
Yeah. And then listen, and they said you got to do it, and I showed up. I was there. I'm gonna get the 52 cents a mile from going back and forth, to the courthouse. So yeah, I followed through.
Yeah. Well, I'm very proud of you, Pierre, for doing so. All right, your thoughts on, because you cover the Big Ten, you cover one of the more surprising stories actually this year in college football in the Minnesota Golden Gophers. They've got some good wins. I know that they're going to be a bowl team, so that's good for them, especially in this era of it's harder for schools that are already kind of behind it, like Minnesota is, in building up NIL and booster, enthusiasm and all that, but that they are competing and that they are pretty good. They clearly upgraded at quarterback. That's worked out for them. And they look very much like a PJ Fleck team. Maybe not the best PJ Fleck team that we've seen, but they've taken on his personality and they're good. So you've seen the Big Ten. They're going to have 4 teams in the playoff more than likely because Penn State's going to fall ass backwards into it, even though their best one might be, honestly, do they play Minnesota here in a couple weeks? Right?
Maybe in 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks. If they beat Minnesota, that might be their best win on the year.
Yeah, it could end up being,
Yeah, so does the Big Ten deserve 4 teams?
That's I was so happy that this was going to be a point of conversation for us here today, because I feel like, obviously there's a big show looming in a couple of weeks between Indiana and Ohio State, and that game is at Ohio State. Now, I think a lot of us, if we were, thinking about that game, a lot of us probably would lean towards Ohio State winning that game, and it would be very likely that Ohio State's only loss of the season would be at Oregon, which no doubt will get them in the playoff, no problem. I don't think anybody should have any issue with that. But if Indiana wins the game and they run the table the rest of the season, I forget who's last on their schedule in terms of who they have to play after Ohio State. I think it might be Northwestern, but I'm not sure. If Indiana goes undefeated, and that includes a win at Ohio State, they've got to be in. They've got to be in. So then you look at Ohio State and you think to yourself, okay, well, Ohio State lost at Oregon, who's the number 1 team in the country. They lost to undefeated Indiana. We can't leave them out of the top 12, right? I don't think they would be left out of the top 12. So then one way or the other, I think Ohio State is in. If Indiana loses to Ohio State, this is the question I want to ask you. If Indiana loses to Ohio State and that's their only loss, are they left out of the top 12? I don't know if I would have a huge problem if they were left out of the top 12, because, their non-conference schedule is about as cupcake as it gets. So, but at the same time, too, if Ohio State is your only loss, I could see the argument the other way. I think Indiana's the tricky team. I do want to talk about Penn State, but I want to start with Indiana first.
Look, if Penn State's only losses to Ohio State and Indiana's only losses to Ohio State. Now, granted, Penn State did play West Virginia in the non-con, and they,
and beat them them.
But West Virginia also is very average. They're very average. So, and I'm sorry to our West Virginia fans, but they feel that too. They know. But if Penn State only has 1 loss and Indiana only has 1 loss, then if Penn State's going in, Indiana has to go in, because the difference in their strength of schedules is not that much. I think my problem with Penn State is they seem to be one of these teams that, history is only applied to them in a good way. They're Penn State.
Right.
What's James Franklin's great history at Penn State?
Right.
Of being 10-2 all the time, and the 2 are always teams that are, Ohio State, Michigan, or Ohio State and the Big Ten flavor of the month, right?
Yeah.
The hot team of the Big Ten, or a non-conference game against a team that's Ohio State caliber. That's That's what his legacy is. They're
Right.
not paying attention to that. Indiana, like getting punished for the non-conference schedule, especially considering some of the other teams that'll be in there with bad non-conference schedules, is laughable to me.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me into the conversation of Penn State. And a serious question here. Do we really see much of a difference in terms of resume and in terms of signature wins, if you will? What is the difference right now between Penn State and Texas? I don't see a lot of difference in terms of when you go down the list of teams that they beat, the non-conference opponents. I know that Texas blew the doors off Colorado State in the opener. Colorado State has turned themselves into a pretty decent team. They've won, I believe, 5 in a row, if I'm not mistaken. But again, an average team, if you will. People don't seem to have a problem automatically putting Texas up there. So why are we having the same hesitation with Penn State? I kind of view it. Penn State and Texas right now to me are the Spider-Man meme. They're pointing at each other and say like, "Wait, you like." I kind of feel this is the same conversation with both of these teams.
I will say this: Penn State had a cupcake schedule that we all saw being a cupcake schedule. Texas, everybody thought they got kind of a good
with Michigan.
Michigan. But it's not their fault that Michigan and Florida and Oklahoma suck. It's not their fault. That happens. Now Georgia doesn't, A&M doesn't, so those are bonuses for them. But right now their best win is Vanderbilt,
right?
Which sucks for Texas to have that as the thing. And here I am defending the Longhorns, so mark it down. But that one, because I remember that the same argument was made in 2014 against Florida State of, well, they're playing all these games that are fast and loose against 500 teams, but their schedule was crazy. Their non-conference schedule, they had Oklahoma State and Notre Dame, and they had big-time games, and then they had Clemson on the schedule, they had Miami on the schedule, they had Florida on the schedule, and all those teams wound up being average or less than. Well, it wasn't FSU's fault that they were. I don't like Texas for all the bad things I'll ever say about them, which are legion. There is I will never say that they short it on scheduling. It's just some years you don't get those quality wins. Now, has Texas, since the SEC season started, had a whole win? No.
Right.
But so to your point, there you go.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong in terms of Texas. I know they've got Arkansas, Kentucky, and at A&M to end the season. I know that's still on the horizon. If they win out, of course. I mean, I'm not going to make any argument whatsoever that they shouldn't be in, and not only in the top 12, but in the top 4. I'm not going to make any debate about that. I'm just talking about to this point right now where we stand. I mean, Miami is another team too, where that Miami could easily have 3 losses on the season easily. Yeah. It's like
no, 4.
4. I mean, even 4.
Cal,
the Cal game, the Virginia Tech,
and Louisville.
Yeah, there you have it. I mean, yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
I obviously has gotten a little bit lucky at times as well. I don't know that they've overly impressed me. So when it comes to Indiana and Penn State, I don't know. Right now, I'm having a hard time keeping both of them out. I'm having a hard Indiana. I could kind of go either way. If Penn State wins out, I think you just, like you were kind of alluding to earlier, Paul, it's kind of like, well, you shrug your shoulders and you're like, yeah, I mean, I guess you went 11-1 in your schedule and you only play who's on your schedule, but do we really think you're a threat? No. So I guess I reluctantly am letting you in. So
yeah,
that's kind of how I feel about Penn State.
Yeah, no, I get it. Like I just think that if we're gonna benefit, like your history is your history. I described it the other day on the show as this is the George Washington theorem to me. Okay, George Washington was the founding father of our country. He was our first president. He did a lot of good things, but there's also the slavery thing, right? Yeah, so right. You have to look at everybody as the whole pie. You can't just be like, well, and look, and I get it. It was a product of the time. He grew up in it. It was never told to him that he was wrong, but also, there should be a point where, if you're a religious person and then you're seeing that, you're going like, I don't know if these two these two ideologies jive, right?
Well, hand
Which
in
he
hand,
claimed to be, right? So there's that. Like, you have those things, and I try not to put today's mindset on guys in the 1700s.
The revisionist history that people like.
Yeah. No, I don't like to do that. That's not good, but it is a part of it. Like, everybody's got pockmarks, to put it mild, scars,
Sure.
to put it mildly. So what happens with some of these big brands in college football is they're given historical credit, which in any given year shouldn't matter what happened a year ago. You should be talking about right now, like who's the best team right now. But because of our inherent biases as human beings, you kind of have these things where you get good credit for good historical behavior as where like anything bad is not applied to you. So Penn State, is going to be a great place to host a playoff game at night in Happy Valley.
No doubt.
Penn State's going to be this, and Penn State has this history, and it's a brand name, and blah, 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 blah. All right, none of that matters. If you're talking about history, you can't just take out the fact that when they have those big games in Happy Valley at night, well, guess what happens to Penn State? They lose.
Yeah.
So,
more often than not than what we've seen in the James Franklin era.
He's only won one of them.
Yeah.
One. So what history, like when we're talking about history, you have to talk about all of it. You have to talk about all of it. Warts and all. Warts and all. That's how it is, because you don't get a full picture unless you admit those things. Like,
right.
Unless you say that. And so there'll be a team without the kind of history that will be close to this that won't get in. And the reason will be, well, historically, and you're like, no, F your history. No. What the history the history of every season starts when the first game is played and it ends when the last game is played.
Agreed.
Before the playoff. It does not matter what guys who are not even on the team anymore did. They're gone. And they'll tell you that it's just about this year. It's just about this year. But, it's not. And that's what needs to be fixed. And that's where, of all the teams in this thing, the one who's going to get the biggest bump from history, should they stay with one loss, is going to be Penn State. Yeah. They're going to wind up likely hosting a playoff game in Happy Valley.
Right.
And likely, based on what happens when they play what we would call now playoff caliber teams, they're going to lose a playoff game in Happy Valley.
The interesting thing for me is in 2 weeks when Penn State comes to town here, Minnesota's coming off of a big letdown loss at Rutgers last week, which really upset me because I thought that probably is going to cost me a bowl trip to Tampa or Orlando, which I would absolutely love in late December. I would love to get out of here for a couple of days. But I'm sitting here thinking to myself, because when you go down the list, all the fans and all the media, we all do this at the beginning of the season, especially when you go down the schedule and you're like, well, that's a win and that's a loss and blah, blah, blah. I'm sitting here, I'm thinking to myself, well, why couldn't Minnesota beat Penn State in a couple of weeks? I don't see, I'm not going to pick them to win, but at the same time, I shouldn't be all that surprised if Minnesota does win that game. And if they do, that may take care of this whole debate in and of itself, no problem if Penn State ends up losing in Minnesota.
Yeah. No, it might. Look, I think if Penn State loses again, then the Big Ten's getting 3 teams.
Yeah.
And Indiana really needs them to lose again if they lose to Ohio State.
Correct.
But I don't know. Well, here's another question. If Ohio State loses to Indiana, will they be punished as much for that loss as somebody not named Ohio State?
That's why, I kind of led off with it. I don't know. That's a great question. It's a fun little debate
we're sitting here assuming that Indiana's just going to be like, well, 11 wins is enough. We've never, this is the first time we've ever won 10, or not the first time, but the first time that anyone who's alive right now can remember us winning 10 games. This is we're happy with that. No. Indiana could very well win that game. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen, but, we'll see.
And that's why I started by saying, with Indiana, if they finish 11-1 and their sole loss is to Ohio State, it's all of a sudden I feel like I'm in election season again. I have two sides of an argument here that I could be persuaded either way in terms of why they shouldn't be let into the college football playoff based on that one loss alone, given their entire track record. Like you said, the entire scope of the history and the entire scope of the season. So I could go either way on Indiana.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, we'll see, and we'll see. We will absolutely see.
Right.
I think it's fascinating to talk about. We're going to take a break here, and we've got into like a little 5 minutes early. We've got an interview to do like right after the show, Pierre. So